The wagon brings a surprise. The wide plains of Montana had a way of making a man feel smaller than he already was. Jed Cole, Jed to the few who knew him, had lived most of his 32 years with that same feeling. He was a solitary figure, the kind of rancher who did his work without complaint and spoke little to anyone. His land stretched far and wide. Acres of sagebrush, a small herd of cattle, and a sagging wooden house that had never known the warmth of laughter or the smell of fresh-baked bread. Life had been quiet, steady, and unbearably lonely. The loneliness had driven Jed to something he never thought he'd do, write to a mail-order bride agency in Chicago. It had taken weeks to draft that letter, his rough hands struggling to hold the pen steady. He had kept it simple. I own land. I work hard. I seek a wife who is kind, willing, and not afraid of hard living. I offer honesty, food on the table, and a roof overhead. It wasn't flowery, not like the examples he'd seen in the agency's circular, but it was true, and truth was all Jed knew how to give. Weeks passed before a letter returned. The woman's name was Clara Whitlock, age 26, with a gentle spirit and a strong work ethic. Her handwriting was neat, refined. She spoke of sewing, reading novels, and wishing for a new life far from the crowded streets of Chicago. Jed had read that letter a dozen times, folding and unfolding it until the paper wore soft at the creases. At night, as the wind rattled the shutters of his cabin, Jed imagined a woman of average size, slim, maybe a little delicate, someone who might bring softness into his hard, barren home. A woman who would sit across the table, pour coffee, and smile at him after a long day of work. So when the stagecoach rumbled into town one spring afternoon, Jed was there, boots polished as best he could, hair combed flat, heart pounding like he was a boy again. The whole town seemed to know why he was there, too. A handful of men leaned against the hitching post outside the saloon, grinning. Women in bonnets whispered behind gloved hands. Jed pretended not to notice. The stage rolled to a stop, dust curling around the wheels. Jed straightened, trying to summon an expression of calm. The driver climbed down, yanked the door open, and extended a hand. And then she stepped out. Jed's first thought was that she must be lost. This couldn't be Clara. The woman who descended from the wagon was enormous. She stood nearly a head taller than him, broad-shouldered, with arms like she could lift a hay bale in each hand without breaking a sweat. Her dress, though modest, strained at the seams. She wasn't fat. No, not at all. She was built like a tree, solid, immovable, powerful. Jed blinked hard, waiting for someone smaller to follow her. But she was the only passenger. Mr. Cole. Her voice boomed across the street, not shrill, but deep and commanding. Jed opened his mouth, then closed it again. Yes, ma'am, she smiled. And to his surprise, the strength in her face softened into something almost shy. Clara Whitlock. I hope I ain't kept you waiting too long. The men by the saloon erupted in muffled laughter. One spat tobacco into the dirt and muttered something about the biggest gal west of the Mississippi. Jed felt heat creep up his neck. Clara extended a hand. It swallowed his whole when he took it. Her grip was firm, her palm rougher than he expected, like she'd known work before. Jed cleared his throat. Welcome to Dry Creek, Miss Whitlock. I'll fetch your trunk. Only, when he bent to lift the trunk from the wagon bed, he nearly pulled his back out. The thing was heavy as sin. Clara lifted it one-handed, setting it down on the ground like it weighed nothing. The crowd chuckled again. Jed wanted to melt into the dirt. The ride back to the ranch was long and quiet. Clara sat beside him in the wagon, her knees nearly brushing the dashboard, her bonnet tied tight under her chin. Jed's hands clenched the reins, eyes fixed on the road. Finally, Clara broke the silence. You don't talk much, do you? No, ma'am. Not unless I've got something worth saying. She chuckled, a deep, rolling sound. That might be a blessing. Back home, the men who talked the most usually did the least work. Jed glanced at her, surprised. She wasn't scowling, wasn't frowning at the land or at him. She seemed almost content, watching the open plains as if they were some grand painting. You've come a long way, he said cautiously. Chicago feels like another world now. She sighed. I was never much suited for city living. Too many people, too many stairs. Jed didn't ask what she meant, though he could guess. A woman her size would stand out anywhere, doubly so in a city full of delicate dresses and polished manners. When they reached the ranch, Clara climbed down first. She stared at the house, small, weather-worn, leaning just a little to the left. A storm had torn half the roof shingles off last winter, and Jed hadn't yet replaced them. "It's humble," Jed admitted, bracing for disappointment. But Clara nodded thoughtfully. "It's strong where it matters. Walls, roof, chimney. I can help mend the rest." Jed blinked. Most women would have wrinkled their noses. Inside, Clara set her trunk by the bed and looked around. "It smells of wood smoke. Home ought to smell of something. I like it." Jed scratched the back of his neck. "It ain't much. I cook beans most nights. Bread, if I remember. I bake," Clara said simply. "And I know how to make stew from almost nothing." Something flickered in Jed's chest. Hope, maybe. By evening, Clara had rolled up her sleeves and set to work in the kitchen, moving about with surprising grace for her size. Jed sat at the table, watching as she chopped onions, stirred a pot, and hummed softly. The cabin smelled richer than it had in years. But the memory of the townsfolk's laughter nagged at him. He kept seeing their smirks, hearing their whispers. He wondered what they'd say next time he came to town with Clara on his arm. Clara caught him staring. "You look troubled." Jed shook his head. "Just tired." She poured stew into a bowl and set it before him. "Eat, then. Work waits for no man." Jed tasted the stew and nearly dropped the spoon. It was delicious. Clara smiled faintly, watching him eat. There now, a rancher ought to have more than beans in his belly. For the first time that day, Jed smiled back. That night, after Clara retired to the small bedroom, Jed sat on the porch with his pipe, staring out across the moonlit plains. He had expected a dainty woman, someone who would look up at him with wide eyes, someone he could protect. Instead, he'd been given Clara, towering, strong, the kind of woman who could probably protect him instead. Part of him bristled at it, his pride wounded by the laughter of others. But another part, the deeper part, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Maybe this wasn't what he'd asked for, but maybe it was what he needed. And so, the loner rancher puffed his pipe and wondered what tomorrow would bring. Strength where it counts. Morning broke with the sound of roosters crowing and the faint aroma of coffee drifting from the cabin. Jed Cole stirred in his bed, blinking at the thin line of light slipping through the shutters. For years, his mornings had been silent, broken only by the rattle of wind or the lowing of cattle. Now, there was sound, pans clanging, footsteps moving with purpose, and the low hum of a woman's song. Clara was already awake, working. Jed pulled on his boots and stepped into the kitchen. There she stood, sleeves rolled, hair pinned back, frying bacon in a skillet like she had lived here all her life. A fresh loaf of bread cooled on the table, its golden crust shining. "Morning," she said without turning. Jed rubbed the back of his neck. "You work fast." Clara shrugged. "Habit. Back home, I rose before my brothers, or else there'd be nothing left for me at the table." Jed frowned. "Brothers?" She nodded, setting plates before him. "5 of them, all bigger than me. Hard as that may be to believe. Pa said I was born strong, built to haul sacks of grain and wrestle hogs if need be. City folk never liked it. I was the spectacle. Men laughed. Women whispered." Jed thought of the town yesterday, the smirks and chuckles. He shifted uncomfortably. Clara's eyes met his, sharp and knowing. "I reckon you heard some of it yourself." Jed cleared his throat. "Don't mind them." "Don't worry," Clara said with a small smile. "I stopped minding years ago. It's not laughter that breaks a person. It's being alone." Jed's chest tightened. He understood that better than most. A new rhythm. The days settled into a rhythm. Clara worked the ranch with a strength that startled Jed. She hauled water buckets, split firewood, and wrangled a stubborn calf that had slipped through the fence, all before Jed could saddle his horse. At first, pride stung him. A man wasn't supposed to be outshone on his own land. But the sting faded into something else, admiration. Clara never complained, never demanded. She simply worked, humming her songs, her laughter rumbling low when the chickens pecked at her skirts. Evenings were the strangest. Jed would sit by the fire, pipe in hand, while Clara mended torn shirts or read from a book she'd brought her trunk. The cabin no longer felt hollow. It felt alive. Still, Jed wrestled with himself. The town's whispers had reached his ears again. Men in the saloon joking that Jed Cole married himself a giant, or that he's the one wearing the skirts now. He clenched his fists at the bar, but he never answered them. Pride kept him silent. Shame kept him restless. One evening, Clara caught him staring at the fire, jaw tight. "You're brooding again," she said gently. "I'm just thinking about them." Jed met her gaze. Her eyes were steady, unflinching. "They laugh at you, Jed, not at me. I've been laughed at my whole life. I can take it, but can you?" The question cut deep. Trouble on the horizon. Late spring brought more than flowers. It brought drought. The creek that fed Jed's herd shrank to a trickle, and rival ranchers grew desperate. One in particular, Bart Kellerman, had been circling like a buzzard. He owned the spread south of Jed's, a greedy man with more cattle than his land could hold. Rumor had it he'd been eyeing Jed's north pasture. It wasn't long before trouble came knocking. Jed returned from town one afternoon to find Clara standing at the gate, sleeves rolled, blocking 3 of Bart's men on horseback. They were burly, sneering, their hands resting near their gun belts. "We just came to water our stock," one said. "No harm meant." "This land ain't yours," Clara replied, her voice low but firm. The men laughed. "Ain't no law says a lady can keep us from the creek." Jed's heart thundered as he rode up. He slid from the saddle, placing himself between Clara and the men. "You heard her," he said evenly. "Get off my land." The men exchanged looks. One spat into the dirt. "You sure got yourself a big guard dog, Cole. Maybe we'll come back when she ain't watching." Their laughter trailed off as they rode away. Jed turned to Clara, anger and gratitude warring in his chest. "You shouldn't have." "Shouldn't have what?" she snapped. "Defended what's ours? You think they'd have listened if you stood here alone?" "Jed, those men saw me, and for once my size work for us. Don't you dare shame me for it." Jed froze. The fire in her eyes was brighter than the sun, and for the first time, he realized just how blind he'd been. When the storm broke, weeks later, trouble returned, this time under cover of night. Jed woke to the crack of gunfire and the smell of smoke. Flames licked the edge of the barn. Cattle bawled in panic. Bart's men had come back. Jed grabbed his rifle, but Clara was already out the door, hauling water with a speed that left him stunned. She bellowed orders. "Get the herd clear. Cover the west wall." Her voice cutting through chaos like a general on the battlefield. Jed fought beside her, but it was Clara who turned the tide. She heaved a burning beam clear of the barn door, saving 2 trapped calves. She stood tall against the riders, her silhouette fierce in the firelight, while Jed's rifle cracked in warning shots. By dawn, the barn still stood, singed but standing. The herd was safe, and Bart's men had slunk back into the hills. Jed collapsed on the porch steps, sweat and soot streaking his face. Clara sank beside him, her massive shoulders heaving. For a long moment, they sat in silence, the only sound the crackle of smoldering wood. Finally, Jed spoke. "I thought I wanted a delicate woman. Someone small, someone I could protect. But last night, I saw the truth." Clara turned her head, eyes searching his. "You don't need protecting, Clara," he said hoarsely. "You are the protection. You're strong where I ain't, and I'd be a fool not to see it." Her breath caught. "So you don't mind?" Jed reached for her hand, rough and scarred, and held it tight. "I don't just not mind. I thank God for you. I've been alone too long, Clara. Alone and half a man. But with you, I reckon I might just be whole." Tears welled in her eyes, and for once, she looked smaller, softer, as she whispered, "Jed." Epilogue. More than they expected. Months passed. The drought eased, and the ranch grew steady again. In town, folks still whispered when Jed and Clara walked side by side, but their laughter carried less sting now. For every smirk, there was also respect, because word had spread about the night Bart Kellerman's men were sent running by a woman twice her husband's size. Jed no longer lowered his eyes when he entered the saloon. He walked proud, Clara's hand in his. And in the evenings, when the work was done, the cabin glowed with warmth, bread baking, books read aloud, laughter rolling deep into the night. The loner rancher had waited for a bride. He hadn't gotten what he expected. He'd gotten something better. He'd gotten Clara, and in her strength, he'd found his peace.